I spent most of the summer of 2019 traveling across small towns in northern Idaho, trying to take a break from my normal life and clear my head. I was 27 at the time, tired of the noise of the city, tired of early alarms, tired of working late nights in a warehouse that smelled like burnt plastic. I had saved enough money to take a few weeks off, so I bought a used pickup truck, packed a tent, some tools, a first aid kit, a small cooler, and a sleeping bag that looked like it had survived a whole decade of camping trips before me. I told myself I would camp anywhere that felt quiet. No crowded sites, no fancy parks, just open spaces that looked peaceful. One afternoon, while driving along a long empty road that cut through wide fields, I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a leaning fence. The paint was fading, but the words were still clear enough. Overnight camping allowed use at your own risk. There was an arrow pointing left into a dirt path that led between two rows of dying corn stalks. The place looked abandoned, the kind of land no one cared about anymore. I thought it was perfect. I wanted quiet, and the emptiness of that farm looked like it had more quiet than I could ever ask for. The dirt path was rough enough to make the whole truck rattle, the tires kicking up light brown dust that hung in the air behind me like smoke. I drove slowly until the cornfields opened into a flat stretch of land with a rusty tractor, a collapsed shed, and tall grass that moved gently with the wind. The sun was still an hour or two from setting, so I parked near the edge of the field and walked around to check the area. The air smelled like dry soil and old grain. There were no houses close by, no sounds of animals, not even birds. It felt like the whole place had been frozen and forgotten. I set my tent near a small grouping of cottonwood trees, the only shade available. The ground felt uneven beneath the tarp, but firm enough to sleep on. I gathered a few dry branches and set up a small fire pit, though I planned to keep the fire small since the fields were dry. I heated up a can of soup on a little metal stove. The wind kept blowing ash around, and every breath tasted a bit like smoke. The sky slowly turned orange, then reddish, then darker as thin clouds rolled in. By the time the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. Farms look warm and harmless during the day, but at night everything changes. The fields become wide, shadowy seas. The rows of crops look like walls hiding something, and even the smallest rustle of grass sounds like footsteps. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just dry leaves moving, nothing else. I put out the fire before it got too dark and crawled into my tent. The quiet was so heavy it almost felt like a sound of its own. I lay still, listening to the faint ring in my ears that always came when everything around me went completely silent. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise that I couldn't understand at first. It was faint, like something tapping lightly against the ground. I thought maybe it was an animal stepping on dry stalks, but the sound didn't move. It stayed in the same spot. Steady, slow tap, then another, then nothing, then another tap. The longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't the sound of an animal. It wasn't heavy enough to be a deer or a cow. It wasn't fast enough to be a rodent or something running. It sounded like something being lightly dropped onto the dirt over and over again with long pauses in between. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself things outdoors make strange noises at night, especially on old farms. But my body didn't believe that. My chest felt tight, and I kept swallowing even though my mouth was dry. When the tapping stopped for a long moment, I felt a small wave of relief. I closed my eyes again, trying to fall asleep. But just when I felt myself drifting, a new sound started. Footsteps. Not fast, not running, not rushing toward the tent. Just slow, steady steps, each one pressing into the ground with weight. Too heavy to be an animal, too slow and careful to be random. My body froze. I lay flat on my sleeping bag, barely breathing, listening as the steps came from the direction of the cornfield and stopped somewhere near my truck. A long stretch of silence followed. Then I heard a metal clinking sound, A gentle rattle, like someone touching the handle of the truck's door. Not pulling it, not forcing it, just touching it. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't move. I didn't even dare shift my weight. The cold air inside the tent felt even colder, and my hands were starting to shake. Whoever was out there didn't open anything. They just stood near the truck. I didn't hear breathing, but I could feel the presence, that heavy awareness that someone was outside. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, moving toward the back of the truck, then toward the edge of the trees, then toward the old shed that was half collapsed. The person, or whatever it was, stayed hidden in the darkness, and I stayed inside my tent feeling trapped. All I could do was wait. For hours, I heard faint movements across the field. Sometimes it was grass shifting, sometimes something metal gently knocking, sometimes distant steps that sounded like they were circling. I never heard a voice or anything human, just the sounds of someone slowly walking around the farm with no clear purpose. I kept asking myself if this was someone who owned the land and was checking on me, but nothing felt normal about it. No one checks their property at 2 in the morning by walking silently around someone's campsite. Just before dawn, the sounds finally stopped. The sky grew pale blue, then a bit brighter. When I finally felt safe enough to unzip the tent, the morning air hit me like a bucket of cold water. The ground was covered in thin patches of dew, and the fields looked dull and lifeless. I walked toward my truck and stopped when I noticed something on the ground. Small pieces of dirt were gathered in a neat stack right next to the passenger door. Someone had scooped little clumps from the field and placed them there in a careful pile. Not scattered, not random, placed. The sight of it made my skin crawl. It wasn't a prank a kid would pull. It wasn't something an animal could do. It was something deliberate, quiet, and strange. And whoever did it had been only a foot or two away from my tent for hours. I didn't pack slowly. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed everything into the truck without care, shaking the entire time. I kept looking at the corn field, expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty, open, and still. That somehow made it worse. When I finally drove off the farm, the morning sun was just touching the tops of the corn stalks. The dirt road seemed longer than before, each bump making me grip the wheel harder. Only when I got back onto the paved highway did I feel myself breathe normally again. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone I knew. It felt like one of those experiences that people would shrug off or laugh about, and I didn't want to hear someone say I imagined it. I knew what I heard. I knew someone was out there walking around my tent for hours with no explanation. I knew someone touched my truck and left that strange pile of dirt. I didn't need anyone else to tell me whether it was real. For the rest of that trip, I avoided farms completely. I stayed near lakes, near forests, near established campgrounds where other people were close by. I never camped alone on empty farmland again. Even now, years later, whenever I think about that night, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. I will never know who was out there, or what they were doing, or why they moved so slowly in the dark. But I know this. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a person walking through that dry, forgotten farm in the middle of the night, watching everything in silence, and leaving before sunrise without ever being seen. I picked a spot deep inside the Sawtooth Range in Idaho in late September of 2017. I had chosen this place because it wasn't popular, and I wanted silence. I was 26 at the time and thought I knew enough about the woods to be comfortable alone. The long dirt road I followed felt endless, and each mile put me farther away from cell signal, houses, or any sense of normal life. When I finally reached a small pull-off near a narrow trailhead, the sun was low, burning orange behind the jagged peaks. I parked, stepped out, and felt that strange mix of freedom and unease that always comes when nothing man-made is close by. The air was cold in that dry, high-altitude way that makes your breath feel thin. Pine needles cracked under my boots as I carried my pack and rifled deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that cut between tall trees. I wasn't hunting anything specific. I just wanted quiet, maybe a chance to see some elk from a distance. The trail was faint, barely used, and within 20 minutes I could no longer hear the faint hum of the world I had left behind. I found a flat section beside a small slope where the ground was soft with old pine needles. The spot wasn't perfect, but it felt tucked away. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes down, and gathered wood before darkness came. By the time the last light drained away, the woods around me felt heavier, thicker. The trees cast long black shapes that blended together until everything felt like one giant dark wall. I started my fire and sat close, watching sparks drift upward and disappear. Trips like this always come with a moment where silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling loud. That moment came when the fire settled into slow, glowing coals. I could hear my own heartbeat because nothing else around me made sound. No birds, no wind, no snapping branches. It was the kind of silence that makes you wonder if something is waiting for you to let your guard down. I cooked a simple meal, ate, cleaned up, and crawled into my tent. I lay on my back and listened. The cold crept in slowly, climbing through the fabric of the tent until my breath made small clouds in the dark. Eventually sleep came, the light and restless kind that comes from being alone in an unfamiliar place. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. There was no reason for it, no noise, no dream I remembered. Just that sudden shift from sleep to being wide awake. The air felt colder than before, almost damp. I tried to slow my breathing, tried to quiet the rising tension. I listened for anything. A small drop of water hit the tent, then another. It wasn't rain, just the leftover moisture falling from the branches above. But under that quiet pattern, I heard something else. It was faint, spaced out, barely a sound at first. A soft crunch, then nothing. Another crunch, then silence again. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal moving naturally through brush. It sounded like steps. Slow, careful steps, the kind made by someone trying not to be heard. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the sleeping bag. I didn't reach for anything. I just listened. My heartbeat got so loud I felt the tent shake with it. The steps came closer, but never fast, never aggressive. Just steady and slow, like someone walking small circles near my camp but not entering it fully. I waited for the smell of an animal, or the snort of a deer, or the heavy shifting weight of a bear. But there was none of that. The air smelled like dirt and pine. The steps were too even to be an animal. They stopped once, so close to the tent that I expected a shadow to pass over the fabric. But there was nothing. Minutes passed. Then the steps moved away, slow again, fading until I was alone with the sound of dripping branches. I didn't sleep again. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside with stiff legs and a dry mouth. The cold morning air hit hard. Everything looked untouched: fire pit, gear, the area around the tent. But the pine needles just past the campsite were disturbed. A narrow trail of faint impressions moved in a slow arc around where I had slept. They weren't clear footprints, but they weren't animal tracks either. They looked like someone lightly pressing the ground with a boot, but not putting their full weight down. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer moving strangely. Maybe my imagination filling in blanks during the night. But the feeling in my chest didn't match those excuses. Something had stood close to me while I slept, and it had done it with intention. I spent the day hiking deeper into the trees, trying to clear my mind, but every time I stopped to drink water or rest, I felt watched. I would look up expecting to see a shape between the trees. Nothing was there, but the feeling stayed. By late afternoon, clouds gathered and covered the sky. The air turned colder and still. I decided I would pack up early the next morning and head back. I wasn't scared exactly, just unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. That night, after the fire burned down again, I lay in my tent fully awake. I kept my rifle beside me, not out of panic but out of caution. The forest stayed quiet for hours. No steps, no animals, no dripping branches. Around maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, something hit the ground outside my tent. It was small, light, and quick. Then another. I thought at first maybe pine cones were falling. But then another came, and another, all hitting within a tight area, not scattered like natural fall. I opened my eyes wide in the dark. Something small hit the tent fabric above my feet, then at my side, then near my head. Tiny taps, soft but intentional. Pine cones didn't fall like that, especially not at night when the air had gone dead still. I held my breath until I felt dizzy. More taps came, spaced out, almost like someone tossing small pebbles or nuts at the tent to test if I was awake. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I kept my breathing slow and steady, pretending I was asleep. After a long stretch of complete silence, I heard those same slow, careful steps again. They circled the tent the same way as the night before. Not close enough to touch the fabric, but close enough that I felt the weight of each step through the ground. The steps stopped behind me, on the side where the slope dropped sharply. They stayed there for what felt like forever. I didn't know if whoever or whatever it was could hear my heartbeat. I tried to keep my breathing calm. My entire body felt frozen. At some point, the steps retreated again. Slow, measured, patient. The forest went silent afterward. I kept my eyes open until the sky started to lighten. I didn't waste time packing. I tore down the tent, stuffed everything in the backpack, and got moving. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone standing among the trees, but I saw nothing except the long, empty trail. The silence stayed with me the entire walk back. When I reached the dirt road, my truck looked exactly the same as I had left it. But when I walked around to put my pack in the bed, I noticed something on the tailgate. A thin smear of dirt, drawn by a finger in one slow line down the metal. Not words, not a symbol, just a single dragging mark, like someone had touched the tailgate lightly and pulled their hand down. It wasn't there when I arrived the day before. I was sure of that. I drove out of the forest without stopping, without looking back into the trees. Even as the sunlight broke through the clouds and marked the end of the night, I didn't feel relief. The whole drive, I kept imagining someone standing just inside the tree line, watching me leave, waiting to see if I would ever come back. I never did return to that part of Idaho, and I don't camp alone anymore. It wasn't fear of animals or storms or getting lost. It was the clear, cold realization that someone had watched me for 2 nights straight with patience that felt far from normal. Whoever they were, they stayed quiet, stayed hidden, stayed close, and chose not to reveal themselves. That choice alone made it worse because it meant they had control the entire time, and I had none. I went out on a late autumn hunting trip in northern Montana back in 2019. I was 27 at the time and still trying to feel confident doing these things alone. I had camped solo before, but never deep in the wooded hills on the edge of the Flathead region. A coworker had told me about a quiet patch of land near old logging roads where people rarely went anymore. He said the deer were good there, and that the area stayed empty because most hunters preferred the open valleys. I liked the idea of being alone in a place where I wouldn't hear trucks or see headlights cutting between the trees. I arrived just after noon, parked my old truck in a clearing, and walked half a mile with my pack until I found a flat spot between 2 tall pines. The air felt sharp but dry, and the ground was covered in a mix of dead needles and pale grass. I set up my tent, stored my food in a dry bag, and hung it using a rope I always kept in the truck. The sky had that pale, washed-out color that happens before the sun drops behind the hills. I could already feel the temperature sinking, but I didn't mind. Cold made me feel alert. After setting camp, I walked the old logging trail with my rifle resting against my shoulder. The woods were quiet in a heavy way, like everything was waiting. I spotted fresh tracks, probably a deer that had passed earlier that morning. The prints pointed downslope, so I followed them for a while until they faded into a patch of thick brush. I stayed out until the light dimmed enough that the air around me turned blue. I didn't want to get stuck stumbling back in the dark, so I returned to camp. I made a small fire, ate a simple meal, and listened to the crackling of the wood. The first strange thing happened that night. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing that made me freeze or panic. It was just a small thing that didn't feel right. I heard a single stick snap somewhere beyond the firelight. I wasn't new to the woods, so I knew animals move at night. Sometimes a deer steps on something hard, sometimes a fox rustles dead leaves. But this crack felt deliberate, like the weight on it had been slow. I waited, looking into the shadows, expecting to see eyes reflecting the fire. I saw nothing. The woods stayed dark, steady, and silent. Eventually, the cold pushed me into my tent. I slept lightly. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up sweating even though the air was bitter cold. I didn't know why I felt so unsettled. Nothing had touched the tent. Nothing was moving outside. It was just that odd heavy silence again, the kind where the woods hold their breath. I stayed awake for almost an hour before drifting off. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed a small thing that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The rope I had tied my food bag onto was slightly lower, maybe 2 inches lower than the knot I remembered tying. The branch it hung from was thick and didn't bend easily. The knot was still tight, so maybe the bag had shifted or maybe I had tied it wrong. I tried to brush it off, but it sat in the back of my mind as I packed for the day's hunt. I followed the ridge above my camp for almost 2 miles. I saw fresh tracks, caught glimpses of movement, but nothing close enough to take a clean shot. By noon, I stopped for a break. I sat on a fallen log, ate a protein bar, and looked out at the hills layered in soft blue haze. It felt calming in a way I needed after the restless night. When I returned to camp around late afternoon, the air had grown colder and the sky looked heavier. The fire pit was exactly how I left it. My gear lay where I'd placed it. Nothing seemed wrong until I checked my tent. The zipper was sitting 2 or 3 inches open at the bottom. I knew I had closed it all the way before leaving. I always did. I didn't store food inside, so animals had no reason to paw at it. There were no claw marks, no tears. It looked like someone had simply undone it partway and then left it like that. My stomach felt tight. I looked around the woods slowly, checking every tree, every shape between the branches. Nothing moved. I told myself I had probably rushed out in the morning and forgot to zip it. But even while thinking that, I didn't believe it. As the sun dropped, I made a slightly larger fire than the night before and cooked my meal. I kept checking behind me, listening for steps, listening for breathing, listening for anything. The woods reacted like they always did, wind pushing branches, squirrels hopping somewhere far away, the faint distant noise of an owl. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, but the feeling stayed. That night I didn't sleep as easily. I lay inside my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric above me. The cold air made the nylon feel stiff against the wind. I tried to slow my breathing. For a while, everything stayed calm. Then, sometime after midnight, I felt a very light vibration in the ground. It was faint, almost like someone had taken a single slow step nearby, then another, each one spaced far apart. Each one soft but heavy enough that I felt it through the earth rather than heard it with my ears. I didn't move. My heart was hitting my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps stopped. The silence that followed felt too thick. I forced myself to breathe normally, counting each breath, waiting for anything to happen. After maybe 15 minutes, the tension in the ground slowly drifted away. I waited another long time before finally drifting into a shallow, miserable sleep. At dawn, I stepped outside with stiff legs and a stiff back. Everything looked normal, but as soon as I walked toward the fire pit, I noticed the footprints. Not animal prints.
Bootprints.
A single set, hard to see unless the light hit them just right. They circled around the area where I kept my gear. They came from the treeline, looped once around the fire pit, stopped a few feet from my tent, and then returned toward the woods. Whoever it was had stood close enough to the tent to leave visible marks. My hands felt cold even though the sunlight hit them. I walked in a full circle around camp, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing watched me, at least nothing I could see. I didn't stay long. I packed my things quickly, tossing everything into my bags without caring about order. I wanted to get out before the person behind those footprints came back. I kept my rifle slung over my shoulder, even while stuffing things into the truck bed. The air felt wrong in a way I still can't fully explain. It felt like the woods were pressing in, like the trees held something unseen between them. When I finally got into the driver's seat, the relief was so strong that I felt a sharp headache behind my eyes. I turned the key, backed out of the clearing, and drove until the dirt turned to gravel and the gravel turned to paved road. About 30 minutes later, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town named Waverly Ridge. I stretched my legs, bought a bottle of water, and tried to calm down. My heart rate slowed enough that I could think clearly. I realized then that leaving had been the right decision. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nobody tried to grab me or attack me, but the signs were clear. Someone had been in my camp at night, close to my tent, close enough to look at everything I had without waking me. Someone had unzipped my tent earlier in the day. Someone had walked around my camp while I slept. Whoever it was had kept a distance, but not a safe one. There was no reason to stay out there and wait for whatever they wanted. I never reported it because I didn't have anything concrete to give. No face, no name, no confrontation. Just footprints and a knot tied lower than I remembered and a half-unzipped tent. People at the station would have chalked it up to nerves. Friends would have said I imagined most of it. Maybe they would be right. Maybe the prints were old. Maybe the knot slipped on its own. Maybe I had forgotten to close the tent all the way. Maybe the ground vibration was an animal I didn't recognize. But there is something I cannot forget. That feeling that someone stood near me while I slept. That sense of being watched in the cold, dark woods without knowing from where. That knowledge that if I had woken up at the wrong moment, I might have seen a shape silently standing outside the thin fabric of my tent. I still go camping, but I don't camp alone anymore. And I don't return to places where the trees grow too close or the trails disappear too quickly. Some spaces in the wild feel untouched for a reason. And I learned that when something feels wrong out there, you don't wait for proof. You leave before the proof shows itself. I was 31 years old when I decided to take a quiet weekend alone in the mountains of northern Spain in late September of 2019. I had been working long hours that whole month, barely sleeping, barely relaxing, and I felt like the noise of my life was getting too loud. I wanted to disappear into nature for a couple of days, away from people, away from phones, away from everything. I picked a remote trail that wasn't very popular, a place where I knew I could hike for hours without seeing another person. The forecast said the weather would stay dry and slightly cool, so it seemed perfect. I parked my car near a narrow gravel road that cut between tall pine trees. The forest was thick and dark, the kind where the sunlight breaks into thin stripes on the ground. I packed only what I needed: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooking pot, a flashlight, a knife, and enough food and water for 2 nights. The trailhead was almost silent except for wind pushing through the trees. I remember feeling calm, like I had finally stepped out of the pressure of everyday life. The first few hours of hiking were easy. The trail sloped slowly upward, weaving through huge moss-covered rocks. Fallen leaves made a soft, crunchy layer under my boots. The air smelled like resin and cold soil. As I moved deeper into the forest, the sounds became quieter. Even the birds seemed far away. By late afternoon, the light had that warm orange tone that comes before dusk. I found a small flat clearing between 2 massive boulders and decided it was the perfect place to set up camp. The clearing felt sheltered from wind, and the ground was surprisingly soft. I pitched my tent, tightened the ropes, and made sure everything was secured. After that, I walked a short distance to gather some dry branches for a small cooking fire. The ground was scattered with needles and broken sticks. I cooked a simple meal and ate slowly while listening to the forest settling into night. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I could hear the distant echo of water somewhere, maybe a stream or a small river. Once the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped sharply. I put on an extra jacket and sat outside for a bit, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The clouds were moving fast, covering the stars now and then. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. When the cold became too much, I climbed into my tent, zipped the entrance, and lay back on my sleeping bag. For a while, everything felt perfect. The air was cool, the ground was firm, and my body felt heavy and relaxed. But somewhere around midnight, something changed. I woke up abruptly, not from a dream, but from a sound. At first, I didn't know what it was. The forest had its usual background noise of wind and leaves, but this sound was different. It was faint, but steady, like slow footsteps crushing dried leaves. I lay completely still, listening. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears. The footsteps were not constant. They came in short bursts with long pauses in between, like someone stopping, then moving again. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. Deer were common in these areas, wild boars too, but the rhythm of the steps felt wrong for an animal. They sounded too measured, too careful, as if the thing, whatever it was, did not want to be heard. The steps came closer, stopping just past one of the big boulders. My tent was positioned so the entrance faced the open part of the clearing, while the boulders stood behind me. That meant whatever was approaching was on the far side of the tent, hidden from my view. I held my breath, waiting for another sound. For a solid minute, there was only silence. Then I heard the slightest crunch, right next to the fabric of the tent. It was so close that I felt the vibration more than I actually heard it. Something was standing just outside. My first instinct was to reach for my knife, which I had placed near my backpack. But I didn't move. I was afraid any sound I made would alert whatever was outside. Another slow step. The shape of the tent wall changed. Something brushed against it lightly, pressing the fabric inward about an inch before pulling away. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might pass out. I stared at that small bulge in the fabric, waiting for it to appear again. I wanted to yell, to scare it away, but the words wouldn't come out. The fear felt thick in my throat. After another long moment, the brushing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slow and heavy, like the person or animal was carefully checking the area. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard nothing. No wind, no movement, nothing at all. The forest had gone completely still. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving, listening for any sign that the thing would return. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into a shallow sleep, though it felt more like drifting in and out of fear. When I woke up again, early morning light was leaking through the tent fabric. Everything inside looked normal. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The clearing looked calm, untouched. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. But when I walked around the tent, I saw the prints. They were human. The soft dirt around my tent showed at least 4 footprints, clear and deep. The size looked like a grown man's. The prints came from the tree line and stopped directly beside the tent, exactly where I had heard the brushing. Then they turned and moved back toward the trees. There were no boot patterns, just smooth shapes with toes. Either the person was barefoot or wearing very thin shoes. The worst part was how fresh the prints looked. The edges were clean, not softened by wind or time. A sick, cold feeling crawled through my stomach. Someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night, moved close enough to touch the tent wall, and then walked away without a sound. And I had no idea who it was or what they wanted. I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life. My hands shook so badly I kept dropping things. I kept looking over my shoulder toward the trees, expecting to see someone watching me. Every broken twig or rustle made me flinch. The morning air felt colder than usual, and the forest no longer felt peaceful. Felt like something had been disturbed. Once everything was packed, I didn't follow the trail back right away. Instead, I cut through the woods in a different direction for a while. I didn't want to make it easy for anyone to predict my path. I walked quickly, trying not to think about the hundreds of places someone could hide in the trees. It took almost 3 hours of constant hiking before I finally reached the gravel road where my car was parked. Nothing seemed out of place around my car, but I still felt watched. I threw my backpack into the back seat, locked the doors, and drove away without looking behind me. Only when I reached a small town almost 40 kilometers away did I finally stop the car. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. Felt too strange, too unsettling. There were no answers, only that one clear fact. Someone had found my camp in the middle of the night and walked right up to my tent while I slept. I never went back to that mountain trail again. Even now, years later, when I think about those footprints and the way the tent wall moved under pressure, I feel the same tightness in my chest. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't some wild animal. It was a real person out there in the darkness, silent, barefoot, and close enough to touch me. And the part that still scares me the most is not what they did. It's what they might have been planning to do before they changed their mind. I picked a random spot to camp that night, somewhere deep in the northern woods of Slovakia in the summer of 2019. I was 31 at the time, old enough to know better than to camp alone in a place I had never explored, but young enough to still believe I could handle whatever the forest threw at me. I had spent the morning walking along an old logging road with no signs, no markers, nothing that told me where it ended or how far it stretched. The road felt forgotten, covered in thick weeds and broken branches, but something about its emptiness made me want to follow it. I kept going until the trees on both sides grew so close that the branches touched overhead, forming a long tunnel of dark green. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in fast from the east, long and heavy, thick enough that they smothered the sunlight. I knew rain was coming, so I decided to set up camp before the sky opened. I found a small clearing just off the path where the ground dipped slightly and the soil looked firm enough to hold my tent stakes. The air felt cold even before sunset. I remember thinking it was strange for early July, but I brushed it off. I unpacked my small 2-person tent, fixed my tarp above it for extra cover, and tried to settle in before the weather got worse. The first drops hit the leaves around me like tiny taps. Within minutes, the gentle tapping turned into a steady hiss that swallowed every other sound. The rain came down hard, and the air filled with the smell of wet earth and pine. I crawled inside my tent to escape the storm, but the wind pushed the walls in slightly, making the whole structure breathe in and out like a living thing. I lay on my sleeping mat listening to the steady crackle of rain hitting the tarp above me. It felt comforting at first, the kind of sound that usually makes me fall asleep fast. But the comfort didn't last. About an hour after the rain started, I heard something move in the trees. It wasn't the wind. Wind has a pattern, a long push followed by a slow fade. The sound came in single, clear steps. The ground outside was soft from the rain, and each step landed with a wet, heavy thud. I held my breath and tried to focus. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. This area was full of them. But something felt off. The steps were slow, careful, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. The steps paused right behind my tent. I lay completely still, my hands pressed against the thin fabric of my sleeping bag. The rain masked most of the sound, but I was close enough to feel the faint vibration in the earth. I thought about grabbing the small knife I kept in my backpack, but I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want to let whoever was out there know I was awake. No breathing, no grunting, no snorting, no sniffs. None of the usual animal sounds, just stillness. After what felt like a long minute, the steps moved again. They circled the tent slowly, like someone walking in a wide ring around me, trying to look in without touching anything. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tarp rustled with the wind, and the rain intensified until it sounded like thousands of needles hitting the ground at once. The storm swallowed most noise, but I still heard each slow step. I counted 7 before the sound drifted farther away, swallowed by the rain. I stayed awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling of the tent, watching the shadows shake with every gust. The storm kept me pinned inside, and the thought of unzipping the door and looking out filled me with a kind of fear I hadn't felt in years. I didn't sleep. I just listened, waiting for the steps to return. Around midnight, the rain eased just enough that I could hear the forest again. Water dripped from the branches in slow, heavy droplets. The air smelled cleaner, colder. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but right as I began to relax, I heard a new sound. A soft scrape. It came from the side of the tent, low to the ground, like something dragging across the fabric with the back of its hand or with a stick. The scrape moved from one corner of the tent to the other, slow and smooth, too controlled to be an animal brushing past by accident. Then it stopped at the front door, right near my feet. My heartbeat felt loud inside my chest. I could almost feel it pushing against the sleeping bag. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited again. Then the scrape started up the front of the tent, rising from the ground to the top seam in one long motion. It felt like a finger tracing along the outer wall. I felt the vibration of it, faint but unmistakable. The sensation made my whole body tense. Rain started up again, heavier than before, but the scraping continued until it reached the tarp above. Then it stopped as suddenly as it began. I stared at the front of the tent for minutes, ready to jump if I saw a silhouette or a hand press against the fabric. But nothing moved. The storm got louder, and eventually the scraping sound disappeared under the weight of it. Sometime after 2 a.m., exhaustion finally won. My body forced itself to sleep, even though my mind stayed half alert. I woke at dawn to silence. No scrapping, no steps, no storm. Just the smell of wet pine and the soft light of early morning filtering through the tent walls. I unzipped the door slowly and stepped into the damp clearing. The ground was soaked and muddy, but what caught my attention wasn't the dirt. It was the footprints. A clear trail of prints circled my tent, spaced evenly apart, deep enough to show the full shape of the heel and toes. Human footprints, bare human footprints. The mud around them showed no sign of shoes, no tread marks, nothing. The prints walked a full circle around my tent, then stopped at the front door exactly where I had felt the scraping. The surrounding trees were empty and quiet, as if whatever had been there had disappeared the moment the sun rose. I checked every direction, but the footprints didn't lead away. They just ended behind my tent, as if the person who made them had walked around me in the rain, stopped, and then vanished into the forest without leaving a trail. I packed my gear faster than I ever have. My hands shook as I stuffed my tent into its bag. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds, waiting to see someone watching me from between the trees. But no one was there. The logging road felt different too. It didn't look like a path someone used. It felt like a place where someone hid. I walked the entire way back without stopping for water, without resting, without looking anywhere except straight ahead. My clothes were soaked with sweat even though the morning was cold. It took me almost 3 hours to reach the small town where my car was parked. The moment I got inside the car and locked the doors, I finally let myself breathe. I knew what I had seen. Those footprints, the slow steps, the scraping, none of it had been in my head. Someone had followed me into that forest. Someone had stood outside my tent through the storm, barefoot, in the middle of the night watching me. I never went back to that road again. I never told anyone locally about it either. There was no point. I had no proof except the memory of that muddy circle and the feeling that someone had waited for the right moment to do something worse than scare me. But the ending was clear to me the moment I reached safety. Whatever walked around my tent that night wasn't lost, wasn't curious, and wasn't passing by. They were out there for a reason, looking for someone camping alone on a night when the rain covered every sound. If I had stepped out of the tent at the wrong moment, if I had made noise, or if the storm had stopped a little earlier, I don't think I would have walked out of that forest the next morning. And that thought has stayed with me more than any ghost story ever could. I planned the trip in late October of 2019, a time when the air in northern New Mexico already carried that sharp cold bite each evening. I was 31 then, working a job that kept me indoors most days, staring at screens until my eyes felt dry and heavy. I wanted silence, space, and a sense of something real, something that didn't glow on a monitor. So I drove out to a remote patch of land near the Sangre de Cristo foothills, a place I had only visited once before on a short day hike. It wasn't an official campground, just a wide stretch of rough dirt, some thin trees, and long broken lines of reddish rock. I chose it because it sat far away from roads and people. At the time, that sounded perfect. I parked at the edge of a slope and took a moment to look around before unpacking. The sky had a washed-out blue color, the kind that almost looks fake because of how empty it is. Dry grass bent lightly in the breeze, making a low brushing sound. The place felt open, quiet, and harmless. I had no reason to think anything different. I spent the first hour setting up my tent, stacking some stones to form a little windbreak, and gathering whatever dead wood I could find. The wood felt dry enough to snap with barely any pressure. I liked the sound of it, sharp and clean, like cracking old bones. When the sun sat low enough to turn the ground golden, I set up my small stove, heated a simple meal, and ate while watching the shadow lines stretch across the field and climb the rocks behind me. By the time dusk fully settled, the temperature dropped fast. That kind of desert mountain cold always feels like it moves straight through your clothes and sits inside your bones. I added another layer and walked a slow circle around my little camp. The sky had no clouds, and every star looked sharp and cold. Nothing seemed strange. Nothing seemed threatening. I felt calm. But later, when I finally climbed into my sleeping bag, there was a strange stiffness in the air. Not a sound, not a shape, just a sudden shift in the feeling of the place. As if the land was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing and closed my eyes. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up without knowing why. No noise, no movement. Just my own eyes snapping open like someone had pulled a string. For a few seconds, I lay completely still, trying to figure out what pulled me out of sleep. The darkness inside the tent felt heavy. I could hear the wind outside brushing the sides of the fabric in soft waves. But underneath that, I sensed something else. I couldn't name it, but it felt like the land wasn't as empty as I believed. I listened harder, keeping my breathing slow. Eventually, I heard a faint crunch, not from the wind, not from settling dirt, something stepping. But it wasn't steady or rhythmic. It was slow, uneven, like someone trying not to make noise but failing, one soft step at a time. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it was an animal, a deer, a stray dog, anything normal. The steps came again, closer this time, dragging slightly, gravel shifting under weight. My heartbeat moved up into my throat, pounding so loud it felt like it filled the tent. The steps stopped just outside, not beside the tent, not behind it, directly in front of the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Something was standing there on the other side of the thin nylon wall. My mind raced through every scenario I could think of. Bear, coyote, lost hiker, anything. But none of those fit the slow, dragging steps I heard. And even if it was a person, what kind of person walks straight to a lone tent in the middle of nowhere at midnight? For a long stretch of seconds, maybe a full minute, nothing happened. Just silence, thick and waiting. Then the shape outside shifted. I heard the faintest sound of cloth brushing against itself, then a long, slow exhale, almost like a tired sigh. I knew then it was a person. The air inside the tent felt tight and thin. I thought about grabbing the knife I kept near the corner of my sleeping bag, but I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want whoever stood outside to know I was awake. I wanted them to lose interest, to move on, to think I was not worth bothering. But they didn't leave. They stayed there, unmoving, for so long that my legs began to cramp in the same position. My shoulders tightened, my breathing grew shallow, and my tongue felt dry. Then I heard steps again, but not moving away. They moved to the side of the tent, slow and dragging, like the person was studying the outline of my body inside the tent. The thin nylon made my shape obvious whenever I shifted. I did everything I could to stay completely still. The person circled halfway around, then stopped again, standing right by the area where my head rested. Another slow exhale, then silence. I don't know exactly how long the person was there. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been half an hour. I only know that some instinct, some deep old fear, kept me frozen until the steps finally moved away. Slow, dragging, uneven, and faded into the darkness. I didn't sleep again. I waited inside the tent until the sky finally began to lighten and the shadows faded. When the first pale morning color touched the rocks, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The cold air stung my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to see everything clearly. The ground around my tent was covered in prints. Not animal prints, shoe prints. Old shoes with uneven soles. One foot dragged more than the other, leaving long, shallow marks. Whoever it was had walked right up to my tent, stood in front of it, circled around it, and then walked out toward the low ridge in the distance. My whole body felt cold when I saw those marks. I followed them only a few steps before stopping. They continued toward the ridge, then down into a shallow gully filled with brush and scattered stones. I stood there, staring, trying to imagine who would be walking alone out there at night. But another thought hit me harder. Whoever it was hadn't approached by accident. They walked straight to me, as if they knew I was there. I packed fast, faster than I ever had before. My hands shook while I rolled up the tent. I kept lifting my head, scanning every direction, expecting to see someone watching from the ridge. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. Before I left, I forced myself to walk back to where the person had stood in the night. The prints were clear. The toe of one shoe pointed directly at where my head had been resting inside the tent. The idea of someone silently staring down at me in the dark made my stomach twist. I threw everything into the car and drove out, following the rough dirt path back toward the main road. The whole time, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind me, dragging one foot slowly across the gravel. When I finally reached pavement, I felt some of the tightness in my chest ease, but not completely. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in a small town nearly 40 miles away. I parked by the far edge and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't report anything. I didn't know what I would even report. A stranger watched me sleep? It felt unreal, even though I knew exactly what I heard and exactly what I saw on the ground the next morning. For weeks after returning home, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise in my apartment, pipes, wind, distant traffic, felt like slow, dragging steps outside my door. I kept seeing that single print, the one facing my head, every time I closed my eyes. But the clearest moment came later, when I finally plugged my phone into my computer to transfer some photos I had taken earlier that afternoon before everything happened. Mixed between the pictures of the landscape and the sky, I found one extra photo. It wasn't mine. It was a photo of my tent, taken from a distance, taken before sunset, taken while I had been out gathering firewood. And there was no one else marked in the frame. Just my tent sitting alone in that wide, empty stretch of land, the light fading, the long shadows already reaching across the ground toward it. That was when everything finally made sense. The person didn't just find me in the middle of the night. They had been watching since before I even set up camp. And that was the last time I ever camped alone. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the mountains of northern Colorado. I was 28 at the time, living a hectic city life in Denver, and needed a break from everything: emails, deadlines, and the constant noise of people around me. I packed my old, battered backpack with the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I also brought a folding knife and a compass, the kind of small precautions you take when you're hiking into areas that aren't exactly crowded. I left early in the morning and drove up the winding roads of the Rockies, the sun barely peeking over the peaks. The air was crisp, with that clean, dry scent of pine and earth. I parked my car near a trailhead and began hiking in. The plan was simple: hike deep into the forest, set up camp near a small stream I had read about in an old hiking guide, spend the night, and then return the next day. The hike itself was uneventful for the first couple of hours. Birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush kept me alert but not uneasy. I reached the stream around mid-afternoon and found a clearing that seemed perfect. The ground was soft, covered in fallen pine needles, and there was enough space for my tent. I set up my small campsite, collected some firewood, and lit a fire just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The shadows grew long, and the forest became cooler and quieter, with only the sound of water trickling over rocks in the stream. As darkness fell, I noticed a strange smell, faint at first, like damp earth mixed with something metallic. I thought it might be a nearby patch of decaying vegetation. The smell grew stronger as I explored a little beyond my campsite, flashlight in hand. That's when I saw it. Half buried under a thin layer of pine needles near the base of a large pine tree was a human leg. The flesh had already begun to discolor, a sickly gray mixed with patches of dark purple. My stomach turned instantly, and my first instinct was to step back and convince myself I had imagined it. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. It was a dead body. From the state of decomposition, I could tell it had been there for at least a couple of weeks. The rest of the body was partially hidden by the tree roots and brush. The arms and torso were twisted unnaturally, one arm bent at an odd angle, fingers curled into the dirt. There was no sign of struggle around the body, and the ground nearby was undisturbed except for animal tracks, probably scavengers. My heart pounded, and I felt a cold sweat on my neck and back. I moved back to my campsite and sat on a rock, trying to process what I had seen. Panic started to settle in, but I forced myself to think clearly. I wasn't a police officer or a detective. I was just a guy who liked hiking. I couldn't handle a dead body myself. The only thing I could do was alert the authorities and stay safe. I fumbled for my phone, and thankfully, I had a signal, though it was weak. I called 911, and after explaining my location as best as I could, the operator told me to stay put and wait for a ranger to arrive. Time crawled. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush felt magnified. The forest that had felt peaceful in daylight now seemed menacing, almost alive in its silence. I tried to keep my fire burning, thinking the light might deter any wildlife. Shadows danced across the trees as the flames flickered, and I couldn't help glancing toward the area where I had seen the body. Fear mingled with a strange curiosity. I wanted to know who it was and how they had ended up here. Eventually, I heard the crunch of footsteps approaching. Relief washed over me as I saw two forest rangers emerge from the trees, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were professional, calm, and immediately took over the scene. I gave them the details and they went to examine the body. One of the rangers motioned for me to stay back. I noticed the body more clearly now. The face was partially exposed, gaunt, with sunken eyes that had lost their life, hair matted with dirt and pine needles. The clothing was torn and weathered, suggesting the person had been missing for a while, exposed to the elements. While they worked, I stayed near the fire, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly life can shift from normal to unrecognizable, how someone could vanish into the wilderness and not be found for weeks. The rangers asked me to describe exactly where I had found it, and then they took photos, marked the spot, and radioed for additional assistance. Soon, a small team arrived, including a coroner. They carefully moved the body onto a stretcher, taking care not to disturb anything. I watched as the stretcher disappeared into the forest, and I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. The rangers asked me to give a statement at the nearest ranger station before they would let me leave. I packed up my tent and belongings in silence. The forest, once a place of escape, felt heavier now, shadowed by the presence of death I had witnessed. Driving back down the winding roads, I kept thinking about the body, imagining the person's last moments, and feeling a strange connection to a stranger whose life had ended quietly in the woods. The next day, I checked the news. The body had been identified as a man in his early 30s, a hiker from a neighboring state who had been reported missing after failing to return from a solo trip. Authorities concluded he had likely fallen and injured himself near the stream, unable to move or call for help. Exposure had done the rest. There was no foul play, just a tragic accident. Reading the story brought a sense of closure, but it also cemented a lesson in my mind about the fragility of life and the unpredictability of nature. Since that trip, I haven't gone camping alone in remote areas. I still hike and spend time in the mountains, but always with company, always prepared for the unexpected. That night in the forest, staring at a lifeless body hidden under pine needles, changed how I view wilderness. It reminded me that the beauty and peace of nature coexist with danger, and that even in places that feel safe, life is fragile and fleeting. The experience left me shaken but also strangely grateful. It forced me to confront mortality in a way nothing else had. I realized how important it is to be cautious, to respect the environment, and to never take a single day for granted. Even though I was terrified and disturbed that night, the clarity and perspective I gained stayed with me. I returned home, packed away my camping gear, and started planning trips differently, always with safety, preparation, and respect for the unknown at the forefront. That summer in Colorado, I didn't just see a dead body. I saw a stark reminder of life's unpredictability, of how quickly ordinary moments can turn into something unimaginable. And though the fear lingered for weeks afterward, it also grounded me in a way nothing else could. Nature, I learned, is beautiful, but it doesn't forgive carelessness. And in the stillness of those mountains, I understood that even the quietest places can hide life-altering truths beneath their surface.